Kia ora whānau, good evening. Thank you for tuning into tonight's Sea Week event, which we have called Preserving Kaimoana, Fishes for the Future. I'm Alison Ballance, I'm your MC for tonight. I'm a natural history writer, a broadcaster, a diver who loves swimming with crowds of fish, think clouds of fish, in a marine reserve like the Poor Knights Islands. I'm a rock pool explorer, and I'm also a pescatarian who's a little concerned about whether eating fish is really sustainable. But before we dive into that particular sea, let's start with a karakia. Tukua te wairua kia reri ki ngā taumata. Hai arahi i a tātou mahi. Mei tā tātou whai i ngā tikanga a rātou mā. Kia mau, kia ita, kia kore ai i ngaro, kia pupuri, kia whakamoa, kia tina, tina, hui e, taiki e. In English, that means allow one's spirit to exercise its potential, to guide us in our work as well as in our pursuit of our ancestral traditions. Take hold and preserve it. Ensure it is never lost. Hold fast, secure it, draw together, affirm. Ngā mihi, and welcome back if you joined us for the first Sea Week webinar. And if you're new to this, a very big hello. While we allow time for others to join, we would like to invite you to introduce yourselves to us in the chat. We would love to know where you're tuning in from. You are welcome to put your answers in the chat box. Now you can access that via the text bubble icon at the bottom of your screen, which should bring up the chat panel on the right-hand side. So look at the bottom of your screen, look for the text bubble icon, and the chat panel should come up on the right-hand side. A bit of background about Sea Week, Kaupapa Moana. This is New Zealand's annual national week celebrating the sea, and it takes place once a year, what has done in the past. Next year it will be from the 5th of March to the 13th of March. But we've also got these webinars which are running every 2 months up until then. Sea Week's mission is about exciting and inspiring all New Zealanders to renew their connections with the sea, which should explain why Sea Week is hosting this webinar series. Ngā Kōrero. Ngā Kōrero is free and it's designed to foster better communication around various ocean-related topics. The webinar series will highlight the diverse connections and interactions that we all have with the sea, which make our daily lives so intertwined with the health of our ocean environment. What we do on the land really does have an impact in the sea. So we see it as an opportunity for people from all over New Zealand to engage with us, learn about our impact on the environment, and the actions we can take to safeguard the ocean. We'd like to say a big thanks to our longtime supporters of Sea Week, and in particular those which have made this webinar series possible. So thank you to the New Zealand National Commission for UNESCO, and thank you to the Live Ocean Foundation. Tonight, we have 4 guest speakers. Those speakers are going to share some of their knowledge, and they're going to highlight various marine management tools that are at work across the country. The speakers span pretty much the length of the motu, from north of Auckland as far south as Dunedin. We'll hear about the different types of marine protected areas and the role these play in marine conservation to ensure that our treasured marine species endure for future generations. So the format for tonight, the 4 speakers each have 10 or so minutes to present on their work, and then when they've all finished, we'll take your questions. We'll wrap by 8:30 at the latest, and a reminder that the session is being recorded, so you can come back later and watch it again, or you can share it so others can watch later. So who are our speakers? We will hear from Dr. Nick Shears at the University of Auckland's Lee Marine Lab. Nick's research interests encompass understanding the ecological effects of fishing on kelp forest ecosystems. He works on how to restore kelp forest. He looks at the impact of sediment from the land and the effects of climate change on rocky reef ecosystems. Nick will be followed by Dr. Chris Hepburn from the University of Otago. Chris will explain some of the research that he's involved in, which is built upon the foundation of building positive connections between kaitiaki and scientists for the benefit of both. He will share a bit about his role in facilitating research which supports communities in their journeys towards resource management. After that, Dr. Gaia Linam, also from Otago University, will share with us some lessons from research and monitoring that's been carried out to support local management initiatives. And lastly, we will have Dr. Darren Parsons from Niwa. Darren will provide an overview of the snapper fishery in the Hauraki Gulf and tell us how Niwa assesses the snapper population structure. Now, there are a couple of provisos before we kick off. We would like to acknowledge that none of us are Māori, so we have an outsider perspective and a scientific view only on the broader issue of fisheries, including the customary use of Kaimoana. And our definition of Kaimoana is not just food for people to eat on the table, but it includes everything in the marine environment. Also note, our panelists are all scientists, and we don't have anyone representing a management perspective. So our panelists bring us a research perspective about work that does offer advice to managers in hapu and iwi, but we're not speaking for the managers hapu and iwi. We support, we don't lead, as Chris put it to us the other day. And I'm sure you know this already, but when we talk about fisheries, it could be commercial fisheries, which are managed under the quota management system, recreational fisheries. Some species have catch and size limits, and there is customary take by iwi. And then we're going to be talking about marine protection. Now that runs the gamut from fully protected marine reserves through marine parks, marine protected areas with various levels of take, as well as traditional iwi conservation measures. So lots to talk about tonight. Don't forget, we'll be taking questions at the end and putting them to the panelists. So these are your questions. Send them to us at any time using the Q&A function, which is also on the bottom of your screen. We will answer as many of your questions as we can after we have been through all the presentations. And a reminder, the webinar is being recorded and it will go up on the CWeek YouTube channel. Right, let's get down to business. Kicking off tonight, in no particular order, but starting with Dr. Nick Shears. Nick is a specialist in rocky reef ecology and marine conservation. He's an associate professor in the Institute of Marine Science at the University of Auckland's Lee Marine Laboratory. Kia ora, Nick.
Good stuff. Kia ora koutou katoa. Thanks everybody for tuning in tonight. I'm going to be giving a very quick overview of the role of marine protected areas and the type of marine protected areas we have in New Zealand, Aotearoa, and their role in preserving Kaimoana. Now, you guys are not alone. You're obviously interested in marine protection. You've tuned in here tonight to hear about it. And this is just some results of a recent survey that's been released by the Hauraki Gulf Forum. This is the Hauraki Gulf here on the left, which is the main body of water adjacent to New Zealand's biggest city, Auckland. It's the most highly used area of probably most of the marine environment around New Zealand. And there's huge support for marine protection. So over 3/4 of people are keen for 30% of the Gulf to be protected. And even if you just single out the fishers, which they're referred to below here, 72% of fisher people are keen for a supportive of marine protection. Now, there's many impacts on the Hauraki Gulf, like most of our coastal waters, from sediment washing in off the shores, particularly in inner parts of the Hauraki Gulf and in our harbours and estuaries. But a lot of the outer part of the Gulf, there really isn't a lot of other impacts, and fishing is really the biggest impact, and that's the one that marine protected areas help protect against. Now, this is an old image, but it was really important in emphasising the scale and intensity of fishing impacts in the Hauraki Gulf. On the left and in the centre is trawling, commercial trawling and longlining, and on the right is our recreational fishing effort. Now, while these patterns may have changed a little bit since this document, what hasn't changed is the amount of marine protection. Only a very small area, these little purple areas, are not fished, so they're no-take marine reserves. And then there's this larger cable protection zone. But really, a very small proportion of the Hauraki Gulf is protected, like most of our coastal waters. And we really live in a fully fished or extremely highly fished environment. This is just an example. This is the Noises Islands, which are a very popular fishing spot in the Hauraki Gulf. On a Saturday morning in the middle of winter, all of these stars, represent, I've put them on top of boats, and there's 85 boats in this image. And so while there's, that's an intense effort in a very small area. And the indications are that with current COVID, well, people have seen it in the Gulf, this has just ramped up even further. So the Gulf is under really immense pressure, and marine protected areas provide a very simple approach to mitigating or eliminating that impact on a spatial basis. And by removing fishing from an area, you allow the species that it impacts to recover, and then those ecosystems that have been impacted to also recover over time. Now, there's a lot that can be said about determining, what effect a marine protected area has, how valuable will it be, and that all depends on factors like the design, the type of MPA, and the extent to which fishing impacts on a particular area in the first place. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to very quickly talk a bit about the different types of MPAs in Aotearoa. Also skim over the sort of overall ecological effects of no-take marine reserves or marine protected areas more generally. I want to talk a little bit about Cray too, because that's a popular topic at the moment, and using MPAs as reference points, and then some final comments on the status of marine protection in the Gulf and the sea change proposals. So we have a lot of different types of marine protected areas in Aotearoa. Looking from an EEZ scale, we have large benthic protected areas and other sorts of seamount closures. We have a number of whale sanctuaries in different areas. This isn't up to date, I'm sorry, where different types of fishing are restricted in order to protect whales and dolphins. If we come in close to the coast, the type of marine protected area that most people are probably most familiar with are marine reserves. So no-take areas, no fishing, and they're administered by DOC under the Marine Reserves Act. If we look at the mainland, less than 1% of our the territorial sea around the mainland is protected. While there's 44 reserves, it's a very tiny area that are totally protected from fishing. There's other types of protected areas, such as cable protection zones or restricted fishing areas, or marine parks that allow certain types of fishing. But Chris will go into this more. Our most common type of marine protected area is a customary protected area. So various types from Taitai, Taiapiri, and Rahui. And these are shown here. And this actually, the Rahui that are shown are just those that are included under the Fisheries Act, but there's a number of voluntary closures as well. And in response to a lot of the stresses on the marine environment and the sort of increasing fishing effort in lots of areas, it's mana whenua and iwi that have really led the charge in recent years in terms of protecting areas, such as the Rahui of Coromandel and around Waiheke. So that's where the progress has been made, and some of the sort of traditional routes have been a bit slow in terms of increasing the level of marine protection. Another form of marine protection which has also emerged and has been hapu-led is through the use of the RMA. And the Motiti protection area is the first example of that, which are no-take here. These are no-take areas, so broadly equivalent to marine reserves around a number of areas where, in order to protect both cultural and biodiversity values. So how do MPAs, how do they work? What do they do? Most of our research has focused on marine reserves, so no-take marine reserves. And the reason our understanding and scientific understanding is focused on these is they've generally been around the longest, and they were also set up for scientific purposes. So this is the Goat Island or Lee Marine Reserve. It's where the university, where we have our marine laboratory, and a large amount of research has been done here over the last 50 years on nearly 50 in terms of marine protection, how things recover inside the reserve, and then also may influence what's happening outside the reserve. And the changes that we've seen in the reserve at Lee have also been evident in other long-term marine reserves in northeastern New Zealand. So obviously the species that are highly targeted, like snapper and tamuri and crayfish, kura, they recover in the reserves fairly rapidly once fishing stopped. And then over time, they have indirect effects on the rest of the ecosystem, in particular, the sort of the declines in the amount of kinnibarrons. And that's been demonstrated in all of these reserves to varying extents in northeastern New Zealand. I'm only going to very briefly show sort of visuals of how this is played out. This is Goat Island in 1975, and all that light coloration underwater there is kinnibarron, so high numbers of sea urchins that have grazed down the reef. So even in 1975, snapper and crayfish were at very low numbers. They've been fished heavily commercially for 20 to 30 years at that point in time, and kinna were fairly prolific in this area. But following the recovery of snapper and crayfish, so they increase in abundance following protection, grow to larger sizes, and it's those large predators that are important in controlling sea urchin or kinna densities. And then over time, that then resulted in this recovery of kelp forest. So as well as the recovery in the kelp forest, you've restored those ecosystems. These reserves protect these exploited species within their boundaries, and in some cases this can lead to this leads to obviously overflow of larvae from the reserves, which can contribute to some of the local fisheries. Now, I just want to talk a little bit more about crayfish, which, and in particular cray 2. So crayfish are generally considered functionally extinct in the Hauraki Gulf. And what that means is they're not extinct. You can still catch them, they're still there. They're just at low numbers, and they're generally at much smaller sizes than they would have been historically. So they no longer play that role in the ecosystem. Now, within the cray 2 fishery, the CPUE or catch per unit effort has declined over time, and there was a large quota cut, roughly halving of the quota in 2018. Subsequently, there's been an increase in catch per unit effort, which is not surprising given the massive reduction in effort and focus on the species. But if we look at what we're seeing in the reserve, we're not yet seeing any response or recovery outside the reserve in the black here. So this is Department of Conservation long-term monitoring data that's carried out by Dr. Tim Haggett. And the surveys earlier this year haven't yet shown any recovery on the reefs. So there's still this disconnect. While they might be catching higher rates and showing higher catch per unit effort, we're not seeing that in terms of higher numbers on the reefs, at least yet. And just another sort of important point with marine protected areas is they can provide an important reference point for fisheries management. And Ben Hans's PhD research, he's been carrying out commercial potting with the commercial fishermen inside and outside of the 2 reserves at Lee and Tawharanui over the last, over 2018, 2019. He's now completed his PhD. All the crayfish were returned, obviously, that were caught. And with this data, he was able to actually calculate fisheries equivalent statistics to then compare with the fishery and use this as an independent way of assessing the state of the fishery. Fisheries evaluate the state based on reference to an unfished biomass, which is modelled and estimated based on historic data. whereas these reserves can actually provide an empirical, real estimate of what an unfished population looks like under current conditions. And based on these current levels, we actually find that, well, Ben actually found that the state of the fishery is much lower than what's been estimated from the fishery. So just while this might reflect some sort of local depletion or how that relates to the wider fishery, we don't necessarily know, because there aren't many other no-take or reserves that we can compare with throughout the area. But the main point being that they can provide useful information as reference points. So just to finish off, where are we sort of heading in the Gulf? There has been a marine spatial plan process called Sea Change, and recently announcements have been made with a number of proposals to increase the area of protection, including 11 high protection areas, which have all been sort of gone through a various sort of stakeholder process to come up with the areas and approximate places, which have then been refined based on best sort of scientific practice around MPA design. There's other seafloor protection areas, and overall this will increase the area under marine protection in the Gulf quite substantially, but keeping in mind that only a small, less than half of that will be in highly protected areas. They're going to use new legislation, presumably, I understand, to implement that. And as far as the sort of target that there's a lot of public support for in terms of protecting 30%, this is a really important first step, but I think we've got a long way to go still to achieve that in the Hauraki Gulf. So thank you very much.
Ngā mihi, Nick. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Don't forget, people, that you can ask Nick questions. We will put them to him at the end of all the panelists. So find that Q&A button, put your questions in there, and they will get asked later. Next up, we have Dr. Chris Hepburn. Chris is co-director of the Coastal People Southern Skies Centre of Research Excellence down in Otago. Now, this connects communities with world-leading cross-disciplinary research to rebuild coastal systems in a changing world. Dr. Hepburn studies coastal ecosystems in southern New Zealand, focusing on the impacts of human-induced change. Sorry about that, human-induced change. Take it away, Chris.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou. Greetings from the Portobello Marine Lab. I guess Nick is currently up in the Lee Marine Lab, so we've got the two I guess, foundational marine laboratories in New Zealand. This lab started in about 1903. So if the internet fails, it's probably something to do with that. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit quite generally about some of my experiences over the last 15 years working alongside communities in their struggles to reinvigorate coastal fisheries and also in some of the rights and practices and ways of life that have been threatened by some of the changes we've seen in the marine environment. So got a lot of slides. I'll flick through them very quickly, and it's nice that Nick's touched on some research. I'm going to be a little bit light on that side of things. So generally my outline, I'm going to talk briefly about coastal fisheries. I was out on the water today with a local Kaitahu Tangatiaki, customary fisheries manager, and he reminded me about it being about people, first of all, but it's also about fish. And without fish, you can have all the rights you like. Without those fish, you're not going to be able to enjoy having fish on the table or the practices and customs associated with that. I'm going to talk very briefly about what's going on in one place. Well, high level, the East Otago Taipuri, one of the customary protection areas that Nick talked about, and then Dr. Gaia Linam, who's following after me, will talk about some of the real hard work she's been doing and actually the specific fisheries information that helps us manage a local fishery. I'm going to talk a little bit about dealing with problems and also building a platform for restoration. I think many people will agree that sustainability is becoming a little bit of a yesterday's sort of word. We need to rebuild to actually enjoy fisheries and the flourishing abundance of fisheries. We need to actually have an abundant fishery to get there. And this is what I'm talking about, not restoration in a nostalgic sense, but restoration in a future facing way that acknowledges some of the changes to come, such as climate change. And I'm also really, as Nick touched on this a little bit, and Alison as well, that we're here to support, and I really support those local leaders who head up and fight for their fisheries and the marine environment. So sort of a north and south series of talks today, and we're down south. We tend to work in fairly cold waters between sort of 45 and 48 degrees south. We have really large kelp, the bull kelp, and obviously the real kelp forest, Maxis pyrifera, the giant kelp. Here's a picture of Gaia from when she was a student diving in the kelp forest just off Otago, really important habitats. So obviously we're in the south, Kaitahu, south of the Waitaki, Ngaitahu generally, and I'll just acknowledge the local people, Moiraki, Katuhurapa and Otako, where I sit at the moment on the Otago Peninsula. Acknowledgement to them and their leadership, and also something called Mahinga Kai, which is central to Ngāi Tahu's interests in fisheries, at least with the people I work with. And these are the places and practices that are associated with traditional food and other natural resources. So it's quite broad, and sort of, mentioning Kaimoana in a very broad sense, this is broad too. So it's it includes all sorts of things. And talking recently to somebody from Ngāi Tahu, the revitalization of their culture over the last 30 or 40 years, this is pretty much all they had, 30 or 40 years ago, was Mahinga Kai, their connections to the wild food gathering. So it's very, very important. And it's also one of the foundations of the treaty settlement that Ngāi Tahu had with the Crown. It was mentioned customary protection areas. So Ngāi Tahu have been very busy and established a suite of mātaetai taipuri and also rāhui legislative closures. I could get into mātaetai a little bit, but the key thing just to remember and taipuri is, yes, they are about marine protection, but central to them, they're about redress under the Treaty of Waitangi grievances. So they're to re-establish rangatiratanga, or local control over fisheries resources. They also happen to be really good ways to manage local stocks of fisheries. And you can see pictures here, I would say heroes of the South, Tangatiaki, the customary fisheries managers. I could name them, why not? Kevin Rehana and John Henry at Timaru, who have worked really hard to look after the eel populations in the Opahi and rivers like that have been badly affected by excess water take. Steph Blair in the South, Awarua from Waikawa, and Stevie Ray, her daughter, working, just to rebuild those traditions and maintain them. So big acknowledgement to them. For us, we are there to support, and we provide evidence and information to give confidence to people with energy and pathways to change public policy. So we're not doing it out of the goodness out of our hearts. We know that if we get this information to the John Henrys, the Steph Blairs of this world, they'll make a difference with it, and they'll change the rules, and they'll try to rebuild the stocks that are of value to their local people, their whānau, their hapu, but also for all when they share some of the the abundance that returns. So it's quite a good place to be, and we don't mind at all helping support local leadership. East Otago Taipuri, which we'll talk a little bit about, is just north of Dunedin, and it was established to really to protect paua fisheries. And as I said before, the objective of Taipuri and Mātaetai is to make better provision for the recognition of rangatiratanga, local sovereignty under the Treaty of Waitangi. I'm a member of the East Otago Taipuri. I'm a scientific sort of advisor, and I have been in that role for about 12 years. Here's a picture of Brendon Flack. So he's the chair of the East Otago Taipuri, and this is him on his river, the Waikowai Itiawa. And he's up there just behind him doing some sampling. This is on a mātaitai, right? They can also be freshwater. Behind him is Greg Kerr and his family. And so Brendon is a thoughtful fellow, and he manages the East Otago Taipuri. And as I said before, the key thing in that fishery is paua, abalone. It's a cultural keystone, a tonga. It is a central part of the culture on that coast, and it underpins a whole lot of different things I don't understand, but are important. Manaakitanga, you know, art and other sorts of traditions that are related to this species. We might just think of paua as scientists of the biology, the growth rates, exploitation and things like that. But when Brendon thinks about this species, and you can see here, this is a mind map of what Brendon thinks about as a manager, and here's the tonga species that includes paua here. And you can see just the complexity of what a community manager must think about when they're trying to manage a connected ecosystem like a taipuri. The taipuri is connected to the land and the sea, to climate change. And there's all sorts of people who he needs to talk to and work with, regional councils, Department of Conservation, universities. And they always don't do the right thing, including us, wonderful scientists. So it's a way more complex story than just focusing on one species. And I guess when Brendon talks of people, this is kind of what he's talking about. When I think about it, I sort of split it up in this sort of fashion. I'm a kelp forest ecologist, a little bit like Nick, in a little bit of a different context, but that's what we love, kelp forests, and they are the cold water equivalents of coral reefs. And they hold key species, and there's threats to them, including excessive forestry that's occurring on our coastline now around carbon farming and things like that, ocean acidification, invasive species. And they provide many values to us alongside their own high-level natural values. The East Otago Taipuri is connected through the catchment of the river I showed you before. We have great things like New Zealand's largest open cast gold mine in the headwaters of the rivers. We have a dredge spoil disposal for the nearby port. We have sewage treatment plants, and we also have excessive fishing. So it's quite a complex thing when you try to restore a paua fishery that has been decimated over the last 30 to 50 years. You also have problems with people trying to establish marine reserves and take away your rights to your coastline. And unfortunately, there I am. So this is the Southeastern Marine Protection Forum, and Nick talked a little bit about what was happening in the Hauraki Gulf. I was involved in this for 3 years, and there are, you know, John Henry, who I mentioned before, was a Ngāi Tahu representative on that forum, and we went through the challenge of trying to establish some marine reserves that were appropriate along our coast. And a lot of it came down, there was a lot of science, but a lot of it came down to horse trading and making things work. We're dealing with invasive species. A recent one that's just turned up, Bonomosonia, we found in 2018. Undaria, the kelp from Asia, has become a major issue on our kelp for our communities, and the values they provide to these fisheries. Heat waves have become an issue as well, and they're undermining the integrity of our kelp forests. We know when kelp forests get above 18 degrees, they start to disappear. And we've seen extended periods of heat waves recently. It appears this year's shaping up. It's pretty warm at the moment. I don't know what's going to happen, but you know, some of this, there's also these sort of things happening too. So what do we do about this? It all sounds like doom and gloom, but it's not really. You can do some local things that could actually build resilience for the values of kelp forest ecosystems generally. So the East Otago Taipuri has worked really hard to provide local measures to protect habitat forming seaweeds. The paua fishery has been closed because of, Gaia will talk about that in a moment. We banned set nets well before a broader ban came into being, and we've reduced bag limits. This is just an example of how local management could and should work, and that the idea that the sea is the same and that rules should apply to be the same all around the country is just nonsense. I'm a trout fisher, and I need to understand the rules, even in a short reach of a river. What's the difference between the sea? And we know for species like paua that their ability to sustain fishing can be very different, even around a headland. I'll just put a little bit of a plug in for a new program that I'm leading out on with Anne-Marie Jackson, Coastal People's Southern Skies, which is a new centre of research excellence. And Gaia is involved, and Nick is too, probably in the future more. Welcome aboard, Nick. And I guess the main thing about this, and I mentioned this, is that the idea of bringing back abundance, the flourishing wellness or motu order of coastal communities. And everyone might, it sounds a little bit like, I don't know, airy-fairy, but our ecosystems and environments reflect us. If we don't have the values of conservation, of protection, of sustaining fisheries, we won't have good fisheries. So we need to work on people and action. And there's a lot of things that we can do. While people might think that climate change seems like a horrifying possibility and there's not much we can do about it, we know that if we, for example, deal with sedimentation coming onto our coast, that our kelp forests are more resilient to heat waves. So there's a lot we can do, and a lot of it is local. So some of the stuff we're doing is we're trying to develop an industry to control Undaria on our coastline, and this, all the income from this program is reinvested into the control program. So we know that local action supported by science can build resilience in these ecosystems, and we know that Mātaitai and Taipuri have the tools to actually make things happen. But unfortunately, many of these places aren't well supported. And while you don't require science to make decisions and change the law within customary protection areas, it helps a lot, unfortunately. Well, it's good and also bad. So things like mātauranga and local knowledge are really important. And sometimes you've just got to make a decision. You don't always need science. Sometimes it's common sense. So hopefully our work will provide the confidence to other communities to make decisions. And then we share this information with the next generation of scientists and also others in our communities. And I'm really confident and excited about our next generation and who's coming behind us. They're better than us, and I think they're going to make a real difference in the marine environment. So just to conclude, I think fishing is why we're here. But it's just part of the story when we restore the fishery. We also need to acknowledge those connections to the land and other impacts that are occurring. Marine reserves don't work in isolation without other management as well. You can put a marine reserve in, but if it's in the wrong place, you're not going to get the results you expect. It takes a long time to restore a damaged ecosystem or a fishery, so it's better to protect ones that we already have. You know, a paua in the water is worth 60 paua in an aquaculture facility that you might reseed. All I would just say is a lot is asked of communities, and when people talk about shifting to community-based management, the support must come. It's not a cheaper option. In many ways, it's more expensive. So I think it's a good way to go, but we need to support communities to actually do the job. Yeah, I guess people do come first, and we hope fisheries, habitats, and ecosystems will follow. Yeah, so that's me, I think. I don't know how long I went. Thanks, Alison.
Ka pai, Chris, that was really interesting. And your comments about the connections between land and the sea build nicely on what we talked about at the first webinar in this series. So thank you. Next, carrying on from Otago, is Dr. Gaia Linam. Gaia is a lecturer in the Marine Science Department at the University of Otago, And she's also, along with Chris, a researcher with the Centre for Research Excellence, Coastal People and Southern Skies. Kia ora, Gaia.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Alison, and thank you everyone for viewing this webinar. As Alison said, my name is Gaia and I am a lecturer in the Department of Marine Science and a researcher with Coastal People Southern Skies. And Chris has beautifully laid out a lot of the background for this talk with the introduction to customary protection areas and the East Otago Taipuri in particular. So I will be following on with a brief snapshot of some of the power restoration work that we are involved with down here that's based in the Taipuri. Now, the restoration of any species or ecosystem comes with a whole host of challenges, and I've listed only a handful of them here. For a start, we have to understand the biology of the species that we want to restore, like what it requires in terms of habitat, food, when does it reproduce, how does it reproduce. We need all of this basic information. And we also need to understand its role in the broader ecosystem. We also need to consider how restoration effort ties into broader management, something that Chris just mentioned. There's very little point investing a large amount of time and money into restoration work if the underlying causes of decline aren't also addressed. And more, we also need to consider resilience to environmental change, particularly climate change. More socio-economic challenges include competing interests. It's always going to be an issue for restoration. We have competing values, and that's just the nature of the beast. And then finally, particularly on a local scale, there are often challenges associated with communities not having enough capacity, resources, or leadership, again, mentioned by Chris in his talk just before. Success can be hard won, and restoration activities can take a long time. So you need people with the right skills and vision and ultimately patience to make sure that the work gets done. And one of the other challenges for restoration is defining what the end goal is. Is it to restore numbers of a particular Kaimoana species? Is it to restore ecosystem function? Is it to restore community links and ensure that cultural values are maintained? Maybe it's all of these things, but obviously your goals will also have an impact on how you measure and define success. And you'll see this in the example that I'll be giving you in just a second around power restoration in East Otago. As well, given the enormity of the task that we are often faced with in terms of degraded ecosystems and species declines, this type of work is often going to require collaboration and cooperation between a number of different and diverse groups. And it's sort of nicely summed up here by this quote in a recent paper by McAfee et al. And it's this cooperative approach that is also reflected in power restoration work that's been going on in East Otago. So as Chris has already mentioned, this map here shows the East Otago Taipuri just north of Dunedin. It's an area of about 25 kilometres that is centred around sort of three main towns, so around Warrington, Karatane and Waikawaiti. It was gazetted in 1999 and is managed by committee that includes representatives from Kati Huirapa, Runaka ki Pukutaraki, the community and the University of Otago. And since its creation, the Taipuri Committee have implemented a whole range of different regulations concerning the management of a variety of species. So your finfish, kelp and shellfish. And as we've already heard, one of the species that has been at the forefront of management in the Taipuri has been Blackfoot paua, or Haliotis iris. Now, many of you are no doubt familiar with this species. Paua are basically a delicious marine snail. They have a large muscular foot covered by a single shell. They are sedentary, which means that they can move, but typically don't move very large distances. And they occupy an intertidal to subtidal range. So you can see them right up into rock pools at the water's edge, down to a depth of about 10 metres. And they're often found in aggregations, so groups of them clumped together. And so a number of these species traits make them easy fishing. The fact that they're grouped together, or that they can be accessible, or they used to at least to be accessible without getting your feet wet, makes them quite easy to fish. Paua are also a taonga or cultural keystone for a number of iwi and hapu around New Zealand. But unfortunately, in many local areas, paua are in decline, including the East Otago Taupiri. And as mentioned, their decline was one of the reasons behind the application for the Taupiri in the first place. This decline and the loss of the species is mirrored by a huge sense of loss for customary fishers, a loss of tradition, customary practice, and mātauranga or knowledge associated with it. Paua used to be able to harvest paua from wading depths. It was a species that was accessible to the very young and the very old, but now only those who can snorkel for them are often able to access them. But in the East Otago Taupiri, the species is being actively managed using a learning by doing approach. And so what I mean by that can be seen in this timeline here of the work that has been done to date in terms of restoring paua in the East Otago Taupiri. So starting with the initial concern over diminishing stocks in the early 90s, jump ahead a few years, and you see in 2008 the first set of paua surveys that were undertaken in the area. Now these are transect surveys, so 30-metre lines extended at a number of depths, and quadrats, so big squares, 1 metre squares, are used to count and measure the paua in these areas. Habitat was also characterised, so the different seaweed communities, the substrate, and other notable sort of invertebrate species in the area is also accounted for as well. And the first set of surveys was actually led by Chris in 2008, and the surveys merely confirmed what the community had been observing. So like Chris mentioned, the science was used to back up what the community already knew, that paua numbers were not great across the Taupiri, and of particular concern was an area called Huriawa Peninsula, an area of enormous cultural significance where less than 1% of the paua surveyed were found to be above the minimum legal size, which is 125 millimetres shell length. The 2008 survey helped support a rahui or closure for Huriawa Peninsula, which was voluntary at first, but then enforced by regulation in 2010. This closure was rolled over in 2012 and 2014, following a second set of surveys in 2012, which basically indicated that there hadn't been any improvement in paua densities on Huriawa Peninsula. A third survey was completed in 2016, which helped support a second rahui, which was implemented at the southern end of the Taupiri. And then finally, in 2019, because of continued declines in areas outside of the rahui areas, the entire Taupiri was closed to the harvest of paua in December. Now, the goal is not to close the fishery forever. The species has too much significance for the community for it to be closed forever, and the management committee are committed to permitting limited harvesting in the future, and they're looking at ways in which they can do so sustainably. Now, alongside these surveys of population size, structure and density, there's been a fair amount of research on paua in the Taupiri, including studies on their predators like the seven-armed sea star, studies on reproduction, genetics, translocation, and this information helps support our general understanding of the species and its role in the ecosystem, and is also shared with the management committee to help them in their management decisions. Now, one of the projects that's currently underway is called Paua, Restoring a Cultural Icon for Future Generations, and it's funded and supported by the new Centre for Research Excellence, Coastal People Southern Skies. And it builds on these years of research within the East Otago taipiri. It has three main components: continued monitoring, because monitoring allows us to determine whether management actions are having an effect and what kind of effect this is. It's also focusing on stock enhancement research, so looking at the potential to use reseeding or translocation to actively restore stocks. And the third component is to look at an experimental fishery, so investigating ways that the community could use customary harvests to allow for harvesting in the future. So in terms of assessing success of power restoration in the East Otago taipiri, well, some of you might argue that perhaps things haven't actually been that successful. Power have continued to decline outside of these closed rahui areas, and the fishery is closed. So yeah, that would be a fair comment. Perhaps restoration isn't particularly successful at this point. But I guess what the story of power in the East Otago taipiri illustrates, it illustrates two very important points. The first is how a community can be empowered to act, to manage and look after their own coastal environment. While granted, there are still some impediments to management in terms of process, and there hasn't been like a full devolution of power, the community can assert their rights and implement measures that support their fisheries. And the second point that this example illustrates is that local actions can have an effect. Without the East Otago taipiri community being engaged and closely observing what's happening in their own backyard, it's likely that power would have continued to decline without any intervention. Even in these rahui areas, we would have probably likely seen a decline. So while it's easy to think that local restoration has no consequence, particularly when you're dealing with global stresses and global issues, and it's easy to sort of throw your hands up in the air and give up all hope, local actions can have an effect, and they do matter. And as this quote sort of illustrates, it can also be a guide for larger scale ambitions. Again, a study, a quote taken from McAfee et al. In 2021. And with that, I'll stop there as well. This work has a long history, and there are a number of people who deserve to be recognised for it, and they're just sort of summarised here. So thank you.
Kia ora, Gaia, thank you very much. That was really interesting. I remember doing a story for RNZ's Our Changing World program a great many years ago with Chris on that taipuri, and it was really fascinating. We are down to our fourth and final speaker, who is Dr. Darren Parsons, a marine ecologist at Niwa. He has worked on a range of inshore fisheries projects, and his research is focused on building a better understanding of how fish ecology is modified by human-induced stresses. Think land-based impacts like sediment, fishing, climate change. Over to you, Darren. I can't hear you, Darren. I'm wondering if that's just me or whether you're not still muted.
Apologies for that. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. You're all good.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so what I was just saying was I thought it would be a good idea to wrap up with a good news story, and that is something that Snapper has become, which it wasn't always like that. So Snapper was one of the main reasons that the quota management system was introduced, because there was serious concerns that they were going to be functionally extinct, basically, back in the mid-1980s. So what I'm about to present is a pretty single species view, which I suppose is traditional fisheries management, fisheries science approach. Not traditional as in from a Māori perspective, but traditional from a more recent perspective. But at the end, we're going to touch on, connect kind of back to what the other speakers have been talking about, which is more of a community involvement and a broader ecosystem understanding. So yeah, just introducing snapper, they are a highly valued species. They're our most abundant inshore fish species in the north. They're very ecologically important, as Nick touched on. They are likely to be involved in regulating rocky reef ecosystems through predation on kinna and the predation on kinna letting kelp forests recover. They've dominated commercial fisheries for 100 years, so they were our most important finfish species when commercial fisheries first developed in the early 1900s, and they're still our 10th most important finfish species. They're by far and away our most important recreational fish species across the country. Yes, you can't really catch them in the bottom parts of the South Island, but the volume that they get caught in the rest of the country kind of makes up for that. So they're over 80% of all recreational catch of anything in New Zealand, and valued as Māori as a taonga species as well. So the development of the snapper fishery, so snapper have been exploited since Māori first arrived in New Zealand in the 1200s, and Māori actually developed really sophisticated methods of fishing for snapper. So when Captain Cook turned up in the Endeavour and put his a net out the back of the Endeavour, it was called a king's seine, he was actually laughed off the water by the local tribes who had nets that were, each panel was built by a different family, and they would tie them together to make a very large net. And there's records from the late 1800s of some of these nets being miles long and catching tons and tons and tons of fish. So we actually did some work at Niwa a few years ago with historic reconstruction on Hauriki Gulf prehistoric snapper catch, using a range of things from middens to stable isotopes in the bones of Māori from back then. And we, putting all of that together, there was an estimate of 1,200 tonnes annually of snapper caught in the Gulf prehistorically. When Europeans first got here, Māori were a really important part of the economy, supplying Europeans with fish as one of the main trades until about the 1870s. The colonizing economy was really dependent on that, and snapper was a part of that. So then commercial fisheries started to develop. So initially snapper were caught with hand lines and set nets from small boats called mullet boats. You can see there's some pictures here, not the middle one, that's a steam trawler, but some of those other ones are mullet boats. So New Zealand's oldest listed company, Sanford's, was started out of a mullet boat by Albert Sanford, who was initially on Pakatoa Island in the Gulf and then Rakino Island all the way back then. And he actually complained about there being so many snapper that when he was smoking the fish, they weren't fat enough to produce a good product. Because they were competing with each other for the food sources. But gradually, as we kind of go through time, we see a serial progression of more and more efficient methods. So we actually see trawling kind of pop up quite early, but it's an early form of trawling where the net was kept open by a wooden beam, so it's called beam trawling. It wasn't that efficient, but still more efficient than catching fish with a hand line or a small net. Then we have long lines. So today's modern long lines can be multiple miles long and will fish thousands of hooks on each set. They weren't quite at that scale back then, but they definitely were efficient, more of an efficient method. And then steam trawlers, so you've heard of steam locomotives or steam engines on land. So steam trawlers caught a lot of the fish up until about the 1950s. These vessels, and so that's what that picture is in the middle. They would even carry pigeons on board so they could report their catch back to headquarters. The council in Auckland owned a couple of steam trawlers to help continue the supply and demand for the market. And then we had Danish seining come in from about 1923, and we basically see the snapper abundance decline in the inner Gulf, and that just through time progressed out as the easiest places to get to got fished out, and the boats had to move further and further out. And that's as early as the 1920s. And that's actually when we see some of the spatial restrictions that are still in place in the Gulf, requiring trawling to occur only in the outer Gulf. That's when they were implemented as a result of this. So this kind of fishing power, as we call it, peaked in the late 1970s. So by then we're seeing powerful diesel trawlers, and sometimes they would pair up, so they had more power to tow the nets. The nets were thin, made of thin material, so synthetic mesh, and they could travel through the water faster. So the catch actually peaked for Snapper 1 at about 11,000 tonne. It's and that picture there is actually from the Nelson tip in the late 70s or early 80s. So they were using spotter planes to find these schools of spawning fish and direct these fishing vessels to them. So instead of bottom trawling, because these fish were spawning near the surface, they actually had to buoy their nets up to catch these fish. And unfortunately, the fish ended up in the tip because they were landed on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, and there wasn't a market for them because everything was closed down, and so they had to just take them to the tip. So that's kind of the fall of the fishery, and we can see that caused the quota management system to be introduced here, as you can see with that dashed line, about 1986. So on the left, you can see the catch, which goes up and then comes down as the populations start to suffer. And then on the right, you can see the population abundance or biomass of the 3 different stocks that compose the Snapper 1 quota management area. And you can see the biomass goes down until the quota management system comes in, and then it's fairly level, maybe with a slight increase after that. So we're seeing when the quota management system was introduced, catches were restricted. So now the commercial catches are restricted to 4,500 tonne per year. And yeah, as I was saying, the snapper biomass has since stabilised and may now be rebuilding. So modern commercial fisheries, the snapper catch in the Gulf is roughly half towed net, and by that I mean trawl, Danish seine, or a new type of trawling which has a different cod end. It's called modular harvest system, or Precision Seafood Harvesting is a company that makes one of those modular harvest system components, and then about half longline. So the longline fishery targets high quality fish. So it's called ikijimi, which is a Japanese term for brain spike, and put in ice slurry, as you can see there on the right. And those fish were flown to overseas markets in the 80s and 90s. So they get there really quickly and being high quality. Japan doesn't buy those fish anymore. They go to other markets. So there's a bit more of an emphasis on quantity rather than quality now. There's also been some quite recent changes in that the Hauraki Gulf catch, commercial catch, has decreased in recent years, and there's multiple reasons that have contributed to that. Part of it's due to the quality of the fish in the Gulf, or just the complete dominance of snapper and lack of other species to catch in the Gulf. So the boats are more likely, or they want to head to other areas, East Northland or the Bay of Plenty, where they can get that bycatch or get snapper that are growing faster, because there's too many snapper in the Gulf. Is the idea that as the population recovers, they're competing with each other for food, so their growth has slowed down. The America's Cup also closing down the port temporarily kind of introduced or affected the amount of commercial catch that was in the Gulf. So in terms of how these populations are assessed, so the last Snapper 1 assessment was conducted in 2013, and it's currently being reassessed. It's a 2-year project. And all this graphic kind of emphasizes is that there are a range of different inputs that go into an assessment model. So you might hear certain things about, oh, there being high catch here or this happening. The assessment is the framework that takes all those bits of information together in an objective fashion with an age-based model, and provides projections of where that stock is going to be, how productive it is, that the Minister for Primary Industries can use to make sustainability decisions with that advice. So just going into a few of the data inputs that go into the snapper assessment. So snapper being a tier 1 or very important species, it has a fully quantitative stock assessment that's conducted. So there's a lot of different data sources that go into it. So we do recreational catch surveys. So these are done on boat ramps. If you're a recreational fisher, you've probably been interviewed. And if you're out in a boat, you've probably been counted by one of these Cessnas that flies over. So these generally happen in the year before an assessment will take place. So we've got the most up-to-date information that goes into that assessment. And as you can see, the recreational catch as surveyed in the Gulf most recently was quite high, well, very similar to the commercial catch, 3,700 tonne at that point in time. Age composition, so this is a data series that goes right back to 1985. So you can see that snapper's had its head cut open so the otolith can be removed, and the otolith lays down rings like a tree so that they can be counted to provide the age. And this tells us about the growth of the fish. It tells us about how successful the spawning was in a particular year. So really important information that goes into an assessment. Then there might also be survey data. So there were tagging studies that were conducted. They are a really good estimate of biomass or abundance. The last one in the Snapper 1 area was in 1994. So we're not using them anymore, but they're still important points in that time series. There's also research trawl surveys, which can estimate abundance. So there was a time series that went from the mid 80s to about the year 2000. That provides an index of relative abundance, and then most recently we just redid that survey again last year and this year. So it's been done. There's an extra data point that isn't on there. So if you have a look at that plot, that's I suppose the only kind of new bit of information in this presentation. You can see the red is the greater than 25 centimetre snapper that are recruited to the fishery, and you can see there's quite a few more in that index of abundance in 2020 than there were in the year 2000. So that's not an assessment by itself. It's one piece of data that goes into an assessment to help inform it, and it's balanced against all the other data inputs that are going in. But that's a good indication that the snapper population has started to rebuild, which is what we've seen in all of the other snapper stocks around the country as well. And then another index of abundance is catch per unit effort, or CPUE. So this is from commercial bottom long line. So this is the data input that went into that 2013 assessment. So you can see there is a positive, slow positive rebuilding there. This is being redone at the moment for the more recent years. So I don't know what the trend is since that plot was done. And then just finishing up, which kind of just ties back into what everyone else was speaking about. So that was kind of the single species fisheries assessment approach, which majority of our fisheries have that applied to them and have done for decades. But what's the way forward? There's multiple stresses, such as land use, the sediment that comes from that land use, and climate change. That can affect the habitats that the fish can use. It can swamp the seagrass that the juvenile snapper use as a nursery ground. We need to be more inclusive. So as Chris was talking about, people are part of the ecosystem, and working towards real co-management is something that is hopefully going to happen in the future. Marine protection has been a real big theme of what people have spoken about tonight. We've got the graphic up there of the kelp forest and the urchin barrens. That's all part of the productivity of the ecosystem that snapper are connected to. So taking that into account, is going beyond a single species approach, but is we're not there yet with building data like that into assessments, but with ecosystem-based management, that's the direction that I think everyone wants to head in. And as Nick kind of alluded to, up in the Gulf, I think there's real positive groundswell of action happening with the sea change program being implemented, and it is inclusive, including stakeholders and iwi partners. And it is considering that broader perspective of other stresses like land use and climate change, and trophic interchanges between different ecosystem components. So I think there's real hope with quite a change like that on the horizon, and hopefully that's something that can take off in other parts of the country as well. Thank you.
Oops, my phone fell over. Kia ora. Thank you, Darren. That was another really interesting presentation. And for everyone out at home, thanks for all your questions. We've got tons of them, and we do have a few minutes to try and get through some of them. So here goes. I'm going to send this one to you, Nick. Nicola has asked, during level 4 lockdown periods, some people have noted that during these periods, they felt there was an increase in dolphins and sharks and other large species close to shore. Is there any research to confirm that? Or have you heard of any discussion in other forums regarding whether perhaps no fishing periods during winter months might be possible in the future? What do you reckon?
Yeah, I think a lot of people made those same observations, and I certainly did. There were whales out in Omaha Bay and huge gannet workups, and there isn't any research to say that is related to COVID. It's very hard to say whether that's to know for sure, but it certainly seemed like it. There were more dolphins coming into Lee Harbour and whatnot. There's definitely some research that's shown the change in underwater sound during lockdown from the lockdowns last year, with data from the Hauraki Gulf contributing to a larger paper as well, and that really showed how the ocean went much quieter, which is presumably beneficial for a lot of the marine mammals. And yes, I think a lot of people could sort of saw it as a bit of a break for the marine environment, and whether it has been raised, whether it could be done each year for a month or two. And there has been some suggestions that when snapper are spawning could be a no fishing time. So yeah, there's various possibilities there. Keeping people off the water for a month though is a challenge, that's for sure.
A challenge indeed. Thank you, Nick. Here's a question for Darren. It's a snapper question from Leon, who asked, are there plans to change limits and size of snapper? So I presume this is to do with recreational fisheries. And is it possible that maximum size limits could be implemented?
Yeah, thanks for that, Leon. Yeah, I suppose after the last snapper assessment in 2013, and so I'm talking about the snapper 1 again, there were changes to the bag limit and minimum size for snapper. So those things will be on the table for the minister, I would imagine, again, but it depends on what this current assessment shows. So if there's need for sustainability decisions and rebuilding, then that could be part of the equation for sure. In terms of maximum size limits, my understanding, could be wrong, is that that's only been implemented in New Zealand for blue cod, where there was a slot limit, and then they got rid of it after a couple of years. It's a really interesting question. Thinking about the predatory force that only a large snapper or a large crayfish will exert, having a maximum size limit as well as a minimum size limit, that creates a slot that you can take those fish from. That could preserve that predatory ability and regulation of kina. So yeah, it'd be a really interesting thing to consider, but there's not a lot of precedent for it in New Zealand at this stage.
Thanks, Darren. Another question targeted at Nick, but Darren might like to pop in afterwards as well. Matt asked, do you think we are managing fisheries at appropriate target biomass levels? And is the notion that a fishery can be deemed sustainable at levels as low as 20%, and he doesn't quite finish, possible? So you might need to quickly explain, Nick, how we set fisheries, what our current system does in terms of the way we manage things.
Well, Darren might be able to explain it better, but
yeah,
we have limits, relative to what an unfished level population would look like. And if it gets down below 10%, that's generally considered a hard limit, and when a fishery ideally would be closed. 20% is referred to as soft limit. And generally, when a population, like for crayfish, when it dropped down below 20%, that was when, for cray too, when there were cuts put in place. Given what we've seen for the crayfish, I think that 20% is probably quite optimistic, at least in large areas of the Gulf. And these fisheries are managed on huge scales. Snappers really managed across the whole of the northeastern New Zealand. So I think smaller areas and higher biomass targets would be a good step. And with the Hauraki Gulf sea change, that has been proposed to make a management area specific for the Hauraki Gulf. Another way of protecting stock is obviously within marine protected areas. If you've got 30% of the Gulf in marine protected areas, you'd be protecting a hell of a lot of stock, but you would obviously need to be weighing that up with adjustments in your catch and your fisheries management as well, which ultimately is sort of the answer in terms of achieving that 30% marine protection. We need to be adjusting the fisheries take as well. Would you like to chime in as well, Darren?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So yeah, I think Nick summed that up pretty well. It's those percentages are percentages of an unfished population that's not a virgin population. So it's not going back in time to what the population was like. It's if we shut the fishing tap off now, where would the population, where do we predict it'll get to in the future? And you can, any biomass level can be managed sustainably in theory. So it's just a matter of balancing inputs and outputs. You could choose to manage it down at 5%. It might be tricky, but it's just about trying to keep it at a level. So the target that's often used is 40%, as what's referred to, but that can differ between species. So I think for kahawai, which have greater recreational value, the minister decided to choose a higher target. And by choosing a higher target, that means that the fish are going to be, the catch rates are going to be probably higher, and you're probably talking about a fish population that's got a larger size structure. So those are values within that population which will be more important to recreational fishers, and that's why that decision was made. Yes, I mean this is all classic single species management, maximum sustainable yield. So the theory is that you pick a target biomass which maximizes the productivity of the stock. So if you have a population with too high a target, then you're going to end up with lots of old fish that aren't growing much. So you want to bring it down a little bit under that theory, so that you've got a younger population which is growing a lot faster, so therefore the yield's higher. So that's the theory that this all kind of ties into. But I think the specifics of where you go with that are based on the values of society and the different stakeholders, and also the particular life history of a fish population. So if it's a species that doesn't reproduce a lot, or it grows slower, then you might want to be more conservative with setting where those targets sit as well. So that are the considerations that the minister will make when making those decisions around where to set the biomass targets.
Those theories around fisheries yields are about getting the most out of a fishery and out of a single species. It's not considering the biodiversity values and the role of that species in the ecosystem. So we can have a really healthy snapper fishery that's dominated by very high numbers of sort of pan-sized snapper, but that's nothing like what a natural population would look like, or an ecologically important population would look like. And that's ultimately, there is talk of that trying to achieve that through maximum size limits, but that's also the point of the marine protection, is to actually have parts of the coast where you have that complete size structure and the biodiversity values, not just the fisheries values.
Very interesting. Thanks, guys. A question for Chris. from Brent, who says, with warming ocean currents, are you following Tasmania's giant kelp forest rescue trials with interest? They seem to be making great progress with selective breeding and resilience genetics.
Yeah, thanks. We're working with the University of Tasmania on a project around building more or less a more resilient super kelp. We're talking about the giant kelp, Macrocystis pyrifera. And we have a number of populations of Macrocystis that we've gathered where I am at the lab now from the Marlborough Sound south to the bottom of Stewart Island. And we're doing a number of sort of trials looking at not only which are more resilient, if we do have certain populations that might be able to survive warming. So we know that Macrocystis is very sensitive over about 18 degrees, and the strengthening of the East Australian current more or less has destroyed the entire kelp forests of eastern Tasmania. This is probably a fairly alarming picture for our coastline, particularly in the south. Some work that Nick did around warming has shown that actual warming is occurring more strongly in the south, and our long-term temperature data sets that align with Portobello Marine Lab and the Lee Marine Lab show that warming has occurred at our field station, but not in the north. And Nick could probably talk a bit more about this, seeing as he published it. But I'll go on around the kelp. So we're working with the University of Tasmania and also universities in Chile that are really the leaders in aquaculture of kelp. And we're hoping to be able to produce something that might provide the services that a giant kelp provides. These grow to be 30 meters long. They're thought to entrain larval lobster so they can reach the reef. Lobster fishers tell us that without kelp forests, they don't catch any crayfish along this coast. So it's a really concerning thing, and I can't think of a species that could replace the giant kelp on our coast. And yeah, so I guess we're working really hard, but within certain physiological constraints, I think we might struggle to maintain our kelp forests in the south, even over we're seeing heat waves occurring now where we're losing significant amounts of our canopy. So it's really concerning, and we are working really hard to try to produce something that might be more resilient. And we've already seen decline in our kelp forests in Marlborough Sounds, a western drift of those kelp forests in the Marlborough Sounds from early work in the 1940s through to now. And that's reflected in also the salmon aquaculture industry. It's moving with those cooler waters, and eventually will be in the south. So salmon will move from the Marlborough Sounds into the south as those thermal tolerance limits are reached. So yeah, so we're working on that, and we're hopeful, but not overly hopeful.
Thanks, Chris. Gosh, so many good questions in so little time. Here's one for Gaia. Sophie has asked, I'm interested in how the science community resource iwi and hapu to be involved in Mātauranga Māori science projects. Is it generally accepted that funding needs to be sought to resource hapu and iwi, or is it mostly volunteer? And what could be done better in this space to ensure that tangata whenua are paid and resourced for their time?
Okay, it's a good question. I would say that more and more, I think there is a recognition that indeed iwi and hapu who are involved in science projects need to be paid and resourced for their time. I think in the past, a lot of communities were asked to do things voluntarily, which would have placed sort of an undue burden on them. But now I think there is more of a shift, particularly when projects are being developed together in partnership, that these communities are being resourced and financed to help support these projects as well. I mean, it's certainly a model that's sort of part of Coastal People Southern Skies, that we work in partnership with communities, and that we pay these people in these communities for their time and for the work that they're doing. In terms of what communities can apply for so that they can do Mātauranga Māori or science projects, there are government initiatives out there that help resource them, but it would require them to sort of do a bit of scoping and find out what these are. Chris might also have some thoughts on this that he might want to add.
Yeah, I can just add a few things. This hidden work is it's a large problem that occurs, and as scientists we're being asked to consult, and so we contact all of these communities with all of our wonderful projects, and they're expected to respond. And I quite often talk to researchers who are a little bit upset that people haven't got back to them when it's not really their job. And I do think that funding community partners in work where they're providing a real useful asset is really important, not just giving money away, but acknowledging that expertise. So some of the funding we've been successful in getting is around from Ministry for Business, Innovation, Employment, Vision Mātauranga sort of placement grants and things like that, where you can help fund people in the community. But I really think research is heading to a space where we need this broader input of mātauranga, of local knowledge, and all of these different things. And I think to do that fairly, people need to be paid for their expertise, as we expect to be paid sometimes for what we do. So hopefully that helps a little.
Okay, we are running out of time, but we do have one final question for Matt, which actually goes to Chris again. Your comments about marine reserves being potentially blunt instruments is an important message for the Hauraki Gulf. Unfortunately, most people think a call for 30% protection means reserves rather than local management options, especially those in partnership with mana whenua. Do you think the call for 30% protection is actually making it harder to really talk about restoring Māori?
I don't know, not being in the Hauraki Gulf, but in the south, it did cause problems with our process. But the key point I was trying to make is it doesn't matter so much the percentage, it's making sure the key areas are protected and having the appropriate management in a place. So 30% based on good spatial management and putting things in the right place could be the perfect percentage for the Hauraki Gulf. But I don't want, you could have 30% protection of a muddy seabed that isn't impacted by fishing. So just having a marine reserve that's large and looks impressive doesn't actually mean you're actually getting to the biodiversity goals that we're after around marine protection. And that's what the point I was sort of getting at. I don't know if Nick's got time to follow up.
Yeah, well, as an example, over 30, I think the benthic protection areas cover over 30% of the EEZ, but they don't really meet, basic, protection requirements. They don't achieve anything. They're generally in areas that aren't fished. So yeah, it needs to be targeted and effective. And there's the comment keeps coming through around the concern of closing off, large areas and therefore just destroying the, overfishing the rest. And that's a, that is a concern, but and that's why we need a more integrated approach that is protection is part of it, improved fisheries management is another, and taking into account all of the cultural aspirations as well.
Kapai, I've got one final quick whiz round for all of you, and the order in which you presented, we'll do this. So we are going to come to you first, Nick. What's the one most important thing that you would do to address the current state of our fisheries and marine environment?
I was supposed to rehearse an answer, sorry.
Off the cuff.
I think switching the tide around really and going to, protecting 30%, I think is an important. We've learned so much from the small amount that we've had protected, and it's just, it's really, when you spend a lot of time working in protected areas, you really get to see the value of them. And yes, we need to take a more integrated approach, but we can't move forward without protecting large areas, particularly of places like the Hauraki Gulf.
Kapai, thank you, Nick. Chris?
I guess the main thing I'd be talking about is the land-sea connection and ensuring we understand that your activities on land have a big impact on the marine environment. So economic initiatives like new farms and things like that can actually damage economic values in the sea. So you might think you're making money on land, but you're actually taking money away from someone else. And one key thing I'd really like is people stop blaming each other and taking responsibility for their own actions. Oh, it's a New Zealander. Oh, it's people in the city. Oh, it's people in the country. We're all responsible, and we all need to act. If you take seafood, if you enjoy the marine environment, you need to give back. And that's one of the principal things that I understand in kaitiakitanga. It's the utu utu. It's a reciprocity. If you take, you've got to give back. Luckily, we're paid to give back, but we also provide a lot of service and stuff like that. So I think that's a responsibility for all of us.
Kia ora, Chris. Over to you, Gaia.
I guess I would suggest that perhaps we use our ecological science, we use our mātauranga, we use our local knowledge to regulate our fisheries appropriately. There's oftentimes a mismatch between what the knowledge tells us and what is implemented in legislation. And so we really need to use our knowledge of what's out there in the ecosystem and regulate our fisheries appropriately.
Kia ora, thank you. Darren.
Yeah, I think just reflecting what everyone else has said there, just a move to a more holistic approach that puts community at front and centre. I really like what's happening with the ahu moana idea as part of sea change in the Gulf. I see that as something that's got great potential for the future for communities and hapuiwi to be defining their marine environment.
Kia ora, thank you. Thank you, everyone. I've learned so much tonight, just like the last time. Lots of different things, that it's about fish and people, that local efforts can have a huge impact, that marine protected areas are important, especially full of protected marine reserves. So thank you all. Gaia, Chris, Darren, Nick, thank you so much. Fascinating. To Sarah and Nat, who organised tonight and kept things running behind the scenes, a huge thank you. To you, our audience, thanks for being here and asking such great questions. And if you asked a question and we didn't answer it, I am so sorry. We'll see what we can do. If you can take a moment to please fill out our survey, which we've just posted in the chat. We'll also be sending out a follow-up email, which will have this link, because we would love to hear what you thought about tonight's webinar so we can make the next ones even better. And the next one is on January the 27th in 2 months' time and will be about marine megafauna. Ngā mihi nui for joining us. I'm going to close with a karakia. Unuhia, unuhia, unuhia ki te uru tapu nui. Kia wātia, kia mama, te nākau, te tinana, te wairoa i te ara takata. Koia rā a rongo, whakarirea aki ke ronga. Kia tina, tina huea taikie. Draw on, draw on. Draw on the supreme sacredness to clear, to free the heart, the body, and the spirit of mankind. Rongo, suspended high above us. Draw together, affirm. Ata maria, everyone. Good night. Look forward to seeing you next time.